All right, as people are joining, I'm just going to get us started with a few quick housekeeping remarks. My name is Claire Ladd, and I'm the Programs and Services Manager at the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, or MNN. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just a few quick items before we dig in. The recording and slides from today's program will be emailed to you following the webinar, so please keep an eye on your email for that. And if you have any type of technical difficulties during the webinar, feel free to reach out to me via the Zoom chat. And if you have questions for the presenter, you can submit via the chat or Q&A function at any time, and we'll make sure to leave time at the end for questions. I also just want to give a little background about us here at MNN. Our three goals at MNN are to strengthen the nonprofit sector through advocacy, public awareness, and capacity building services. We offer regular webinars in partnership with our affiliate members as part of our capacity building efforts. So please stay tuned for future topics and reach out to us if you have any topics you'd like to see. Our efforts are made possible by our more than 600 member organizations. To those of you who are members, thank you so much for your partnership. And if you have not yet joined but would like to take advantage of the opportunities or learn more, please visit massnonprofitnet.org/join. All right, today's webinar is titled Securing Your Nonprofit, How to Effectively Implement Cybersecurity Solutions. It's presented by Bryan Lukralle, Chief Strategy Officer at Charter Technology Solutions. So I'll hand it over to Bryan to get started.
Thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. Just into the afternoon. Very excited to talk about this topic today. This is some initial housekeeping here from our side. We have an agenda. So I'm going to talk about CTS a little bit. That's my organization. Talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing for nonprofits within the cybersecurity realm. And we put together what we call a blueprint of the most impactful things that an organization can do to strengthen your cybersecurity posture. And we're going to share that today. And as Claire mentioned, we will send over the slides after. And if you have any follow-up questions on any of the topics, not going to go into too much detail for what'll probably be about 45 minutes of going through some slides. But if there are any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer them as a follow-up. I have my contact information at the end. All right, so we'll get started. So CTS, we are a managed service provider focused on mission-based organizations. We work with a number of companies and organizations within Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York. We're based in Brooklyn, New York. That's where our main office is. And the services that we typically provide are managed cybersecurity services, outsourced IT. So those are for small businesses up to, let's say, 100, 150 people, to more of a co-managed agreement where we're working with an internal IT person and helping to provide the services that they're not able to provide. We also do consulting and project implementation services. So we're an IT company, just from top to bottom, and we have a strong focus on cybersecurity, which is why we're here today to talk about cybersecurity. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we're seeing for nonprofits today, and we'll then talk about some of the solutions for these challenges. So focusing on three main areas. The first is data breaches. So I think if you follow the news, there are a lot of publicly known data breaches that happen for very large companies, also some smaller. But there's a lot of data breaches that are happening within the nonprofit space and in commercial organizations as well, where they're not reported to, doesn't end up in the news. And data breaches are very common because there is a lack of cybersecurity controls, and it is increasingly easy for a foreign actor to be able to get into a company's network, into their email, and extract data. And the big risk there is obviously if your data is getting out to other people, there are potential regulatory fines, there are legal fees, and then reputational damage, which no organization wants their name to be in the news because they leaked out information about someone's address and phone number and social security number and things like that. So there is an increased risk of data breaches today. Second piece is cyber insurance. So it's fast becoming challenging to get the right type of cyber insurance policy to protect when one of these breaches does happen, because the amount of controls that a cyber insurance provider is looking for is just getting heavier and heavier. It used to be if you had antivirus on your computers and you have a firewall in your office that checks enough boxes to get a high amount of coverage and a low premium. Now it goes beyond having multi-factor authentication to having 10 more things, 20 more things. So it is challenging working on a limited budget to be able to meet the requirements without your premiums shooting through the roof. So we recognize that that's a challenge. The last piece, which is not all the way there yet, but is growing, is the regulatory side. So from a national level, there is no specific federal law that says that you need to do a certain amount of things to protect personal information. Unlike in Europe where they have GDPR and other regulations. But on a state level, there are a lot of things that are going on in various state houses within the U.S. New York State, where we're located, has an act that was signed in a couple of years ago that has fines if you have a data breach and you don't notify appropriately. And even if you do notify appropriately, there still can be fines based on how many people's information are leaked out. Massachusetts specifically has been considering for a couple of years the Massachusetts Data Privacy Act, which is now SD 267. It's been reintroduced a couple of times, but it is in the state Senate, and there is an expectation that either this year or next year it should pass. And if it does, it will be an equivalent law to what we see in New York State, what's in California, because they also have an act there. And I would expect at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a federal law around what organizations need to do to protect the privacy of people whose data you hold. So knowing that that is coming, we are recommending that nonprofits take the earlier steps that they can because it is a journey from being very immature with cybersecurity to being very comfortable and mature and feeling like you're doing all the things that you can do on a limited budget. So don't wait until the law passes and then realize that you don't have the controls in place to protect against the potential fines and reputational damage. Try to do the things now and take concrete steps. So when that time does come, whether it is at the end of this year or it's 2 years, 3 years out, that you're doing the right things. So these are the three main challenges we're seeing today. And I want to briefly hit on cyber attacks. You can, go to Google and type in cyber attack, and you'll see a lot of things that pop up for big organizations. LinkedIn has had breaches, Facebook, other large companies, but I want to focus on a couple of I want to say smaller than that. One is the Massachusetts state employee payroll system had a data breach where personal information was leaked out, not of everyone, but of bits of information. That was last year. There's a large healthcare system last year that had a major ransomware attack. That's an attack where files are encrypted on computers and you're not able to access them unless you pay a ransom to usually it's a foreign actor that is, trying to extract money. And one thing that impacted us in New York State 2 years ago, New York City had a very large data breach where 45,000 students and staff had their social security numbers, date of birth, other, important numbers leaked out. So this is an issue that affects enterprises, mid-market companies, and small businesses. There are some metrics that I did not put in here because I can't verify them where you see, 80% of businesses are hit with a data breach every, 2 to 3 years or something like that. So there is definitely things that are going on here, and we're recommending that people take concrete steps to protect against them. So in terms of our blueprint, the way that we designed this, we wanted this to be something that is immediately applicable, even if you don't have a gigantic budget for cybersecurity, which most organizations don't have that earmarked initially. It's something that you would need to build towards if you needed it. So it's based on industry best practices. The one that we tend to lean on the most is the NIST, which is a federal federal uh, department, which is the cybersecurity framework, NIST CSF, and then CISA, which is another federal department. They're CPGs. These are basically best practices around what businesses should be doing to protect their organization from a cybersecurity standpoint. We built this to be very um, you know, very tight, 10 steps, very prescriptive, follow these steps through. There are options of doing this where you leverage a vendor, um, a partner that could be a company like us or lots of other companies that exist. And even if you're working with an outsourced IT provider today, you could bring this to them if you're not doing some of these things. It's definitely worth having a conversation. But you can also do these things internally. There are aspects that are a little more challenging to do with just internal IT or a very small organization. But in some cases, you can just buy a product, implement it, and you've already made an impact on your cybersecurity posture. If you follow these 10 steps, um, you will get to a very high compliance with the key frameworks that do tend to come up when it comes to these new laws. So it does seem crazy that 10 steps can make that big of a difference, but they address many different risk factors when it comes to your cybersecurity. So if you kind of hit all of these, and this is what we typically recommend for our clients, you can make a major impact. So without further ado, hit the first one, multi-factor authentication. So we strongly recommend, and I think most organizations have this for their email and have probably had this for a long period of time now, although we do often run into new clients that don't have this in place. We strongly recommend having multi-factor authentication. That is, again, when you get a push to your phone to an app or a text message to your phone. You should have multi-factor turned on your email, and that would also go for any other external systems that you access that have anything that would be considered confidential. So if you have any applications that you use, like a Salesforce, a NetSuite, a QuickBooks, anything that someone could access from outside of your office where you work, should have multi-factor authentication turned on and enforced. It should not be optional for people to log in to use. It should be enforced. Otherwise, you're leaving a major gap. We do recommend using what the industry term is phish resistant MFA, so using a mobile app like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator. Also YubiKeys, which are a physical key that you can buy that's $15 and you can set up and it has to be on your person to log into a system. Those are significantly more secure than doing the text message based MFA because SIM cards can be swapped. If someone really is trying to break into a system, you can convince Verizon or AT&T. Uh, People have done this before many times. So if you can, it's good to do the phish resistant, but if you can't, SMS is definitely better than nothing. Um, and the last piece is if you do have a lot of cloud-based systems like a Zoom, Salesforce, NetSuite, there's something called single sign-on, which you may or may not have, which allows you to integrate how you log into your email into all of those other cloud systems. That is the best way to implement multi-factor because you have multi-factor for your email, and then you're using that same method to log into all of the other systems. So that's a great way to work. And typically, as a nonprofit, the licensing from Microsoft, as an example, is pretty inexpensive. So we always push to move towards single sign-on. How you implement this, if you have an internal IT team, this is not one of the more complex technical solutions to put in place. Most um, level one, level two IT people can deploy multi-factor and deploy single sign-on. So you can certainly use an internal IT team. There's also the option of using a third-party integrator to implement this type of solution, and then your internal IT team can just support it afterwards. So this is probably the biggest one, and it has the biggest impact typically because most breaches we're seeing are coming through email. They're coming on clicking a link or clicking an attachment. And if they don't have multi-factor on their account, if their password ends up in the wrong hands, that person is now just logging into their account with no restrictions and getting access to things that they should not have access to. So we strongly recommend MFA. Step two is backups. So in general, you want to have a copy of any data that you're storing somewhere. You want to have a backup of that data stored somewhere else just to ensure that if you were to have a breach, the ransomware thing I was mentioning before, you want to ensure that that data is stored somewhere else. So you can then restore back from that data and not lose any information. Um, It's very critical that you keep a certain amount of backups. We usually recommend 90 days. That's kind of a standard across most backup software systems. 90 days is a good set. You could probably get away with 30 days. 90 days is probably better because sometimes you don't know that you had something going on until a couple weeks after, and 30 days could be too little time. Um, and one piece I want to note here is this is not just about servers. A lot of organizations now do not have servers in their office. They just use cloud applications. It's very important to know that Google and Microsoft have their own version of backup. They have versions of data. They have some things stored in vaults, but it is not true backup. It is not something where you can do a granular recovery of a mailbox or a file share in SharePoint or Google Drive and bring it back from 2 months ago if you found out that there was a attack. So if you say that you have backups and you're just backing up a server and you're not backing up Google or Microsoft, you're typically not meeting the requirements when you check a box on a cyber insurance questionnaire and say, "Oh, yes, I have backups." So this is a piece that tends to get missed. Same as the other option, there is software that you can purchase, and an internal IT team can manage. Very simple to set up, typically. It backups for cloud like Google and Microsoft don't break. They tend to work pretty seamlessly. Servers can break sometimes, so you need someone to maintain them. So internal IT team can do this. You can also utilize a third-party integrator to implement and manage. The next item is manage detection and response. This is, think of this as a security guard watching all of your different systems every minute of every day and looking for vulnerabilities. This is looking at your endpoints, so all of your desktops and laptops. This is looking at the traffic on your network. So if you have an office and there are lots of different devices, you have cameras, you have phones, you have access control, you might have lots of different IoT devices, seeing what's going on with them, and also looking at the cloud, looking at what's happening in Microsoft and what's happening in Google, and looking for things that don't look right. Looking for people logging in from a location they've never logged into before, looking at someone transferring data, large amounts of data from a Google over to a random server in Eastern Europe. So what this is doing, managed detection and response, is detecting the vulnerabilities and then responding as quickly as possible. Typically, shutting down access as soon as something is seen, being able to roll back something that happened to reverse something, a bad actor doing something in your systems. So this is typically considered MDR is the terminology you'll see, which is a combination of, and I know it's a little silly, a combination of multiple technologies. There's EDR is the endpoint, XDR is, I don't know why they call it X, but it's really for cloud, and then NDR is network. So these three technologies tied together are then considered MDR. This is something that comes up on cyber insurance questionnaires very often now. Didn't 3 years ago, but does now. Um, we also recommend retaining logs at least 90 days because if you do have an event that happens 40 days ago and you need to provide that information to your cyber insurance provider, or you need to identify what data was actually lost if you have to notify people, you're going to want to know what you lost. Because if you don't know what you lost, you have to assume that you lost everything, and that's a lot more, potential fines and reputational damage and all that stuff. So, MDR is a great thing. It's gotten a lot cheaper. It used to be very expensive. People would pay tens of thousands of dollars for a small organization each month. It's now gotten to the point where it's more of could be $1,000 a year, depending on how large an organization is. So this is something we typically do recommend using a third party to implement. It's very hard for an internal IT team to staff and have the technical expertise to actually manage something like this. It's very specialized skill sets. So we typically do recommend reaching out to a managed security services provider who can provide different options, and it's usually priced based on how many people are in your organization and then how many locations you have. So this is a big one. This is the first one where there's a little bit more expense. The other two is, I'd say, more on the inexpensive side cost wise. This will carry more costs, but it has gotten significantly less expensive over the past, I'd say, 2 to 3 years. The next is having a remote monitoring and management software. So this is basically platforms for your IT team to know what do we have, what computers do we have, what network equipment do we have, what applications do we have. Having everything documented and tracked in a centralized place is really critical from a security standpoint, so you understand where your risks are and understand uh, where you need to be taking actions, typically around patch management, making sure that you have security updates on all your computers, on your servers, and you're updating third-party applications like Adobe, Java, Google Chrome, Firefox, things like that. So this is this is something that is usually provided if you have an outsourced IT provider. Nearly every outsourced IT provider is going to provide some kind of remote management software and documentation systems. So if you are working with a MSP, you're usually covered on this front, and they should be able to provide you with a report at any time showing what assets do I have, how old are they, what is the patch status of them. So that's typically included there. But if you have an internal IT team, many internal IT teams work on a very tight budget and they don't think to implement things like this, and they usually have spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are usually tough to verify, are not going to be very helpful in a situation where you're trying to, you know, provide information for an audit. The next is security awareness training. This is something you probably heard the term before. So, security awareness training is very important because your staff are the most likely place that someone's going to get into your network and do some damage. So, we typically recommend implementing a training program that consists of a couple different things. The first is actual training videos, so teaching them key security concepts, not clicking on an email the second that it comes into their inbox, thinking critically when someone reaches out to them, saying they're from IT or they're from finance or they're from certain departments like HR. So video training is a great thing. There's a lot of different options out there, but we usually recommend doing that annually. The second thing is doing email simulations and exercises. So basically training people, sending them fake phishing emails and them being able to identify and not click the button, right? So the standard security awareness training systems will automatically send out these phishing emails every month to basically try to trick people to click them. And then you get great reporting back on the people who are consistently failing. And those are the people that you would recommend remedial training to, because if they're constantly not thinking before they click on buttons, they're the most likely weakest link for your organization when it comes to cybersecurity. So this is a piece of software that you can implement um, very easily with an internal IT team, but you also can leverage a third-party integrator like an MSP or an MSSP to implement and manage. Number six is email security. So built into Microsoft and Google is some advanced controls today that will stop phishing emails or attempt to stop phishing emails. We've typically found that Microsoft and Google don't do enough to protect against the types of things that are getting through those systems today. We usually recommend implementing a piece of software on top of your email that will leverage AI, machine learning, whatever buzzword is most appropriate today, to try to identify emails that are malicious, and provide visual indicators to your staff on when to exercise caution. So today you'll often see things like if an email comes in from external, it'll say external email. And that's very important because if someone tries to send you an email from an internal person, like let's say your CEO, and it says external, the idea is that would trigger in your mind, why does this say external when it says it's coming from Bob, the CEO? The challenge with that is that people still tend to just click things without thinking. So we like these more advanced systems that will provide more of a bright red alert if it's clearly someone that's being spoofed internally, especially VIPs. This is a piece of software that can be deployed very simply. It's usually a monthly fee based on the amount of staff that you have, and it greatly increases the kind of security wall between your email system and your staff. So this is something that can be done by your internal IT team or through a third-party integrator. Um, if you are bringing this information back to someone after the webinar is completed, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, these are technical terms. Ask them if they have implemented these records. These are basically web-based records for your domain, for where your email sits, that helps to protect against external email threats. So as long as these are set up, it will cut down on the amount of spam and potential, phishing emails that come in, but it does need to be set up. And there are a lot of organizations I've seen that just set up their email to get email and never set up these security records, and it doesn't cost anything to do. It just needs to be set up. So happy to share more information on this as a follow-up, but this is a key point. The next thing is network segmentation. So if you don't have an office, this does not apply. But if you have a physical location where there's a lot of equipment, there's a lot of laptops and desktops and network equipment, we typically strongly recommend that you segment your network so staff members and guests cannot see each other, and any back-end IT infrastructure, so all of the network gear that runs your network and goes out to the internet, they should all be separated from each other, because that will ensure that if there is a piece of risky equipment that does get plugged in, there's a limitation on how much that can spread to other devices. So let's say, because I've seen this a lot, people say they have a guest network and the guests can see the staff. So if someone comes in, you give them your guest password, and they come in with a computer that is running some kind of virus malware, that thing can then spread to your local devices, all of your staff, and then any of your infrastructure, your servers. So it's very important to ensure that those are separated. This again costs nothing. Normal networks that have a firewall and switches and things like that, it's just about setting it up and then validating it, on some kind of regular basis, every year, every quarter, just checking to see, can my guests get to my staff, and can my staff get to my switches and firewalls, or are they being blocked unless it's explicitly allowed for a business case? So your internal IT team can do this. You can also utilize a third-party integrator to implement this. But this is a very simple one that I too often see not being set up properly. We've worked with a lot of schools as well as nonprofits, and this is a critical piece. There are students that have their own network, and we need students and staff to not see each other. And we also need guests to not see students or staff. So there's typically 4 or 5 different networks that should not see each other. But in a standard nonprofit that's probably just going to have staff and guest network, you need to make sure that those things can't see each other, because that's how a bad actor, or even someone who isn't meaning to be a bad actor, brings in a computer that uh, sees the wrong thing and gets access and can spread something bad. This next piece is around just endpoint control. So you implement all the things before step 8. You've already made a ton of progress. You're protecting externally, you're protecting your email, you're teaching your staff not to click on things. There are additional steps that you can take that typically do not cost anything from a licensing perspective. And I'll highlight these 4 right here. One is your staff should not have administrative rights to install whatever they want on their computers. That should be turned off, and it should go through IT. If you turn that on, someone can click on something malicious off a website, install a program, and that program now has rights to access anything on the local system, including profiles and mail and things like that. So it's a very good practice to turn off local administrator rights for staff. The second is, typically you don't want to allow USB drives to be plugged in unless it's part of their job role. Um, we've seen many cases of people picking up a USB drive that is either, by mistake, they see one sitting in a parking lot. I've literally seen this before. It's also done as part of security phishing tests, where people will leave a malicious USB drive in the office on a table, and someone picks it up and goes, "Oh, this is cool." They plug it in, and nothing happens. And they're like, "Oh, that's weird." They throw it out, and what happened is it downloaded some malware onto their computer, and now they get some kind of ransomware virus, and their files are encrypted. So, um, in general, we recommend not allowing for device drives, USB drives, unless it's part of their job role. They need it if they're, bringing presentations to different places. The amount of jobs that require USB now is getting smaller and smaller, because most people take advantage of cloud storage. They'll send a file into their OneDrive or Google Drive or Dropbox, rather than having to lug around, even a tiny USB drive. Next piece, again, this costs nothing, full disk encryption. So by default, nowadays, when you buy a new laptop, it's going to have encryption built in. What that means is if you leave your laptop at a train station, or you leave it in a public place and someone takes it, if you have encryption on that device, they cannot get into that data unless they have your actual username and password. If you don't have full disk encryption and your device is lost or stolen, They just need to pop the hard drive out of the computer, plug it into a dock, and they can copy any of the data that's on that machine. So BitLocker is something that has been common with Windows 10 since 7 or 8 years ago. File Vault is the version of that for Macs. This is again a piece that doesn't cost anything from a licensing perspective. It's just having it in your standard operating procedures. So I just recommend talking to your MSP or talking to your internal IT and just saying, do you guys deploy full disk encryption by default with new machines? And is it in place on all of our existing computers? Just so you have peace of mind that it is in place. The last piece is for wireless. We've started to recommend the last 2 years, I'd say, not giving out a pre-shared key where you just say, here's our wireless password to the internal network, using something called a certificate-based system. So basically, IT deploys a certificate to your computer that says this computer should be able to get onto our wireless, and they don't need to know a key. The reason why this is better is that key that you're giving out can be written on a post-it note, and someone walking around the office, someone delivering mail can pick up that post-it note. And now they have access to the internal network. So wireless profiles is a very important piece. And again, all of these can be done without any additional software costs. So we strongly recommend doing it as soon as you can. 2 steps left. We strongly recommend doing a review of your third-party vendors. So that means any organization where you share data. So that could be a application like a Salesforce or a NetSuite or a QuickBooks or a project management tools like an Asana or a Smartsheet. Um, Anywhere where you're putting data, you want to ensure that that vendor is doing the right thing when it comes to cybersecurity themselves, because obviously you can do everything that I've said so far, steps 1 through 8, and if you put your data into some kind of line of business application, a donor management system, and they don't have the proper cybersecurity, then they have a breach. You're still going to experience the same pain of you made a choice to put your data into the system. They then had a breach, and now you have to go explain to your people what happened. So we strongly recommend, taking a look at all the vendors that you have today. There is a way, just using Google, honestly, to go through and look up, hey, what types of certifications do they have? Do they have a dedicated security page? Do they talk about SOC 2 Type 2 is the designation we see a lot, where it is if you get SOC 2 Type 2, you're getting certified by an independent auditor that you're doing a lot of really good things for internal security, and that will usually indicate that you're less likely to have a breach than someone that doesn't have that. Second piece is, how does your own staff access the system? Like I mentioned before, if you have MFA on your email, that's great. But if you also have some cloud-based system that they log into every day, is MFA required to get into that system as well? So that's very important. And then just look to see if they've disclosed any other cybersecurity incidents in the past. So once you've done that, you could literally just make a document that says, here are all my vendors. I last reviewed them on this date. I found no issues, because you may need this at some point. Typically, when you build out security policies, you want to have an idea of where your risks are outside of your organization. So completing a self-assessment is a great way to do that. You can also leverage an MSSP or advisory services firm to come in and do an outside audit. I usually recommend doing an audit every, 3 to 5 years anyway, outside of your organization, because it's good to get a second opinion, but often budgets don't allow for that. So it's a great idea to do that, but if you can't make that happen, at least doing the self-assessment on a regular basis is a good thing. And then the last piece is having an actual cyber governance program. This is where we get into policies and plans and procedures and stuff like that. So we found that the best way to do this is to pick a framework that makes the most sense. The NIST cybersecurity framework is the one that we usually recommend. There are some organizations outside of the nonprofit world that need to align to things like, if you're a defense contractor, there's certain frameworks. If you work in financial services, if you're, dealing with the stock market, there's other things. If you're in healthcare, you deal with other frameworks. Generally, the NIST cybersecurity framework is a really good framework to standardize on. We then recommend creating policies and procedures. There are ways to do this on the cheap. There are ways to find policies online. If you Google hard enough, you will find policies and procedures that will check most of these boxes here. These are the ones that we typically recommend having. Um, but the problem with that often is that if you download a policy and you don't customize it to what your organization's actually doing today, you're basically not doing the right thing, right? If an auditor asks you about it later, they're going to say, I'm glad you have all these policies, but these don't match your organization. You just did a find and replace and put your company's name in. So it is usually recommended to leverage an outside party if you don't have an internal cybersecurity person to go through, start with a template, then customize that template based on what your organization is doing, and then build out a what we call a risk register and policy exception document. So this basically says, here are all these policies. There's 50 things in these policies we're not doing today. We're acknowledging that we don't do them today, and we're going to create a plan to eventually be able to do them in 3 years. That puts you in a significantly stronger position when it comes to an outside auditor because you are acknowledging that you aren't doing everything you need to be doing, but you can show progress towards getting there, versus trying to be perfect up front. And also, you don't want to adjust these policies too far from the template because they're built to meet compliance. So you don't want to remove things that you're not doing because you'll never get there then. You'll never actually get to the point where you can put that back into the policy. So it's better to keep the policy as is and then note in a separate document, here's what I'm not doing and build some kind of cadence. We usually recommend at least quarterly, but monthly if you can spare the time to just show that you're making progress in this and track it. There is software that you can download and purchase that is not terribly expensive. There are some expensive ones. They call it GRC. That software will teach you, it'll show all of your risks in one single place. And if you ever have an auditor come in, they can review that GRC and say, oh, okay, you have 30 things that you haven't done yet. Let's work on these five over the next 12 months. So those are the 10 main steps. Again, we'll share this deck with you as a follow-up. The NIST cybersecurity framework, I want to just highlight really quickly. This was designed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's been around for over 10 years now. Um, it is a little bit complex to look at from a top level, which is why I always do recommend working with a cybersecurity expert externally who can help you digest what's going on. I do have some links here, but they have all these different categories with different items. So like inside of data security, you'll find, 6 or 7 different items of things that you should be doing. Same with each of these other ones. So if you do go through the process of implementing the 10 steps that we mentioned today, you will impact about 80% of the individual sub items underneath each of these categories. So it will show that you're making significant progress. And we found that most organizations that are able to do just these 10 things will be much less likely to have a breach, and you're going to have significantly better success when it comes to cyber insurance, getting your premiums down. We've had plenty of clients that have not been doing most of these things. They implement MFA and they implement managed detection and response, and their premiums could go down by 40, 50%. Because it's very hard for someone to insure someone that isn't doing anything to protect their organization. In terms of next steps, we do have 2 links here when I send this over. One is from CISA and one is from CIS, which is about how to implement cybersecurity at an organization. Again, if you're able to do a lot of this internally, you can leverage these public resources to kind of walk you through it. We are, I have to plug CTS because that's part of why I'm here. We do help nonprofits with this journey to cybersecurity maturity. We also have we have like a free assessment that we'll do as part of, so most of these things are paid engagements, but we do have a free assessment that we've been doing for the last 8 to 12 months that has been really impactful within the nonprofit space. So again, reach out as a follow-up if you have any questions or if you're interested in that. And then Q&A, I will Claire, I will half pass back to you, but we can pull up and see if there's any questions. I had a couple that came in from when we were doing some follow-up prior to the webinar, but anything that's come through here?
chat, Kaylee had a question about if you know of anyone who does this type of stuff for nonprofits in Rhode Island. Is there a nonprofit in Rhode Island that would greatly benefit from these resources like what you offer?
Sure. So we work with clients throughout the Northeast. We're actually currently engaged with some people in Rhode Island right now. But we're happy to talk to anyone in the Northeast. We prefer to work with organizations that are, near where our people are, and we have staff that are in Connecticut and in Boston Metro and Springfield area. So we certainly can talk to someone in Rhode Island. So be happy to speak, Haley. Um, I guess that was the only question in here, right?
Yeah, it's the only one that I'm seeing. But anyone who's on, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A or the chat. But if you want to address anything that you got, previously, do that as
Yeah,
well.
I'm looking at the questions. There were questions about how do we develop a cybersecurity strategy for a nonprofit? What policies are important? I think I touched on those. Best practices for training, mentioned those. Let's see. Someone had asked a question. We heard from an insurance agent that clients are being targeted because they have cyber insurance and they know you have insurance. Is this real? I do not think this is real. This is not you having an actual policy for cyber insurance would not be something that someone could publicly look up unless it's disclosed somewhere. And the reality is that when you do work with, if you do have cyber insurance and you have a breach and you let your, insurance company know when a breach happens, they will help you negotiate with someone externally if you have like a ransomware type situation, and they'll help negotiate that number down. If you go in blind into a conversation with some random hacker in Eastern Europe, hate to pick on Eastern Europe, but you're less likely to get a more favorable result. So that is not something I believe is a real thing. So please get cyber insurance. It's very important to have.
I've got a
Um,
question, got a question in the Q&A from Olivia. What should we do about multi-factor authentication if we sometimes have an account with only one license slash login and then have to constantly go to one person for the verification information?
sure. So when you run into that type of situation, we typically recommend using a password manager. So one good example of that is 1Password. If you deploy a password manager in a more like a business plan, because I use 1Password personally, but if you deploy it in a business plan, you can give multiple people access to a single account, so it's shared, and you also can store the multi-factor token inside of the password manager. So as long as you're securing your staff's access into the password manager, that token, that, 6-digit number that changes every 15, 20 seconds, they'll have access to it, but then you don't have to be passing phones back and forth. So that's the best way to attack that type of situation. Obviously, the best case scenario is that you don't have to share logins, but we know that that happens a lot, especially with bank accounts and logins to things from like a state and county level. Like those sites tend to be one login for an organization, so that's the best way to attack that.
And a question from Carolyn, for a very small nonprofit with 6 employees and no IT person, have never heard of cyber insurance before. These steps are a bit overwhelming. Any tips on how a small org like ours should get started?
Um, I think the best way is to start with a conversation with company like us or someone. I'm not a sales guy. I like the cybersecurity stuff. Have a conversation with someone who's an expert on this. Often the conversation can be more consultative and less around trying to push products and solutions. When you're 6 people, it is tough because often outsourced providers like us tend to work with organizations that have 20, 30, 40 people because the scale of cost is challenging when you're at that size. But there are a lot of tools that we can recommend. And again, anyone who's on this webinar, we're happy to have a follow-up conversation, even if it's not a fit working with us on a regular basis. We can point you in the right direction. A lot of the things that are in here, like security training, a non-technical person could go to a website, sign up for a subscription for, you know, 20, $30 a month and can set it up. And you can even leverage an outside person to set it up for you, and then you would be able to maintain it going forward. So there are aspects of this that are definitely daunting. But I think it just start with a conversation that has some expertise in this, and then you can find your own specific path based on your budget and your plans for growth. Because small organizations that will eventually become very large, it's worth making the investments now. But if you're always going to be five or six people, you don't want to over architect it. But everyone is getting targeted right now, unfortunately. It's not just known entities. It's pretty much anyone that has an email address on the internet could end up with a phishing email and have someone in there. So you just want to take the necessary steps.
Question in the chat from Anna. Our cybersecurity insurer offers an assessment where you can give them third-party access to platforms like Google Workspace, SharePoint, etc. Do you recommend taking advantage of those services, or is that giving your insurer information you might not want to?
If it's a large reputable name, there's nothing wrong with that. But typically they're looking for gaps so they can increase your premium to protect themselves. More often than not, you can find providers that don't need to have that level of access. So I usually say you probably should try to avoid it unless you're very strongly tied in with your agent and the provider. Um, we do have partners we work with to recommend like so basically there are master agents that can get you quotes from 50 different places. There are ones have expertise with cyber insurance. I usually recommend them. And again, anyone that reaches out, I can give you some names of people that we worked with before. Um, the benefit of working with people with cyber insurance expertise is that there are a lot of traditional insurance agents that have been working in insurance for 30, 40 years that really don't understand this side of the business, cyber. Like it just became a cash cow for them because now every business needs it, so they want to sell it, but they don't really understand what questions to ask and the amount of coverage that's important, the right amount of deductible where you actually can take advantage of it if something happens. So there's some nuance that's missing from a lot of traditional insurance agents, not to talk smack about insurance agents, but it is a challenging industry because it is changing very quickly. I think that's the last one I see here.
Yeah, that's all the questions that have come in, but we'll give people another minute in case anything else comes up. But yeah, just to reiterate, I will be sending around all this information afterwards. So everybody will have, your contact information and slides. Yeah, well, if there's no further questions, then I'll just say thank you to Bryan for this great
Of
presentation.
course.
And thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. We're really glad that you're interested in our webinars and stay tuned for future programs from MNN. And just, yeah, have a great rest of your day, everyone.